The morning air was crisp and quiet as the black limousine rolled through the iron gates of the cemetery. Inside, Margaret Carter sat perfectly still, her gloved hands folded in her lap. The sunlight filtered through the tinted windows, casting soft shadows across her face. She had done this every year for the past 7 years, visited this place, stood before the same polished headstone, and carried the same weight in her chest. The car came to a stop, and her driver, a kind older man named Mr. Thompson, opened the door for her without a word. He knew better than to speak on days like this. Margaret stepped out, her designer shoes pressing into the damp grass. The cemetery was vast, filled with rows of silent stones, each holding someone's grief. But she only had eyes for one, Michael's grave, her son. She walked slowly, her breath steady, though her heart ached. The bouquet of white lilies in her hands trembled slightly. She had chosen them because they were his favorite, or at least she thought they were. The truth was, Margaret wasn't entirely sure. She had been so busy building her empire, her billion-dollar company, her charities, her name in the headlines, that she hadn't paid enough attention to the little things. Not until it was too late. She reached the grave and knelt, brushing away a stray leaf that had settled on the marble. The engraving was simple: Michael James Carter, beloved son, taken too soon. She traced the letters with her fingers, her throat tightening. "I'm sorry," she whispered. It was the same thing she said every year, the same useless apology. The wind rustled the trees around her, and for a moment, she let herself imagine it was his voice answering. But there was no answer. There never was. Then she heard it. Soft, muffled sobs. Margaret turned her head, frowning. A few rows over, near a much smaller grave, a woman was crouched low, her shoulders shaking. Beside her stood a little boy, no older than 5, clutching her sleeve. The woman's dark skin glistened with tears, and her voice was raw with pain. Margaret hesitated. She had never been one to intrude on others' grief. But something about the way the woman cried so openly, so desperately, pulled at her. It wasn't the quiet, dignified sorrow of the wealthy visitors who came here. This was a pain that couldn't be hidden. She stood, her legs stiff from kneeling, and took a step forward. Then another. The woman didn't notice her at first. She was too lost in her own world, whispering words Margaret couldn't hear. The little boy, though, looked up. His big brown eyes were wide and curious, but sad. So sad. Margaret didn't know why she kept walking. She didn't know why she cared. But for the first time in years, she felt something other than her own grief. She felt someone else's, and it was about to change everything. The grass whispered beneath Margaret's feet as she moved closer, each step deliberate, as if the earth itself might protest her intrusion. The woman's sobs were raw, unfiltered, the kind of crying that came from a place too deep for words. The little boy, still clutching her sleeve, turned his face toward Margaret, his eyes glistening with the reflection of a grief he was too young to fully understand but old enough to feel in his bones. Margaret hesitated, her gloved fingers tightening around the stems of the lilies she still carried. She had spent years perfecting the art of distance, of maintaining the unspoken barriers between herself and the world. Wealth had taught her that. Loss had reinforced it. But something about this moment, the way the woman's shoulders curled inward, the way her fingers dug into the soil as if she could reach through it and pull her pain back out, made those barriers feel fragile. The woman lifted her head then, sensing a presence. Her dark, tear-streaked face was lined with exhaustion. Her braids pulled back into a messy bun, strands loosened by the wind or by the restless hands of grief. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Margaret saw the flicker of recognition, not of her, not of the billionaire Margaret Carter, but of another mourner, another mother, another soul standing at the edge of an abyss. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, the words automatic. It was what people said in cemeteries, wasn't it? Empty words, hollow and polite. But this time she meant them. The woman wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, smudging the tears but not stopping them. "Ain't no need to be sorry," she murmured, her voice thick. "Unless you the one who took her." There was no malice in the words, just a tired, aching bitterness. Margaret flinched. The rawness of it startled her. She was used to conversations layered with agendas, with unspoken calculations. This was different. This was a wound laid bare. The little boy tugged at the woman's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, his voice small. "Who that?" The woman Tasha. Margaret would later learn her name was sighed and pulled him closer. "Just a lady, Jamal. Don't be rude." Margaret knelt then, not caring about the damp earth staining her expensive slacks. She placed the lilies beside the tiny grave marker, her eyes tracing the name etched there. Layla Williams. Born sleeping. A stillbirth. Or maybe something worse. Margaret's throat tightened. She thought of Michael, of the way the world had kept spinning after he was gone. How unfair it had felt that the sun still rose, that people still laughed. How? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Tasha's laugh was sharp, brittle. How'd she die? Or how am I still breathing? She shook her head, her fingers brushing the edge of the marker. Bad heart. They said it could have been fixed if we caught it sooner. But catching it cost money. And money ain't never been my friend. Margaret's stomach twisted. She had spent millions on hospitals, on research, on plaques with her family name. How many Laylas had slipped through the cracks while she wrote checks for galas and tax deductions? The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Jamal shivered, pressing closer to his mother. Margaret made a decision then, one she couldn't explain even to herself. "Come with me," she said, standing abruptly. "There's a cafe near here. You shouldn't be out here in the cold." Tasha eyed her warily. "Why you care?" Margaret didn't have an answer, not one that made sense. So she told the only truth she could. "Because I don't think anyone else has." And just like that, the first thread of a new story began to weave itself between them, one that neither of them could yet see. The cafe was one of those quiet, tucked-away places that only locals knew about, the kind with chipped mugs and a smell of cinnamon that clung to the walls. Margaret had never been here before. She frequented establishments with crystal glasses and sommeliers, places where the chairs cost more than most people's rent. But this was where Tasha had nodded toward when Margaret suggested getting out of the cold. And so here they were. Jamal's small hands clutched a mug of hot chocolate, his eyes wide as he blew on the steaming surface. Tasha sat across from Margaret, her own hands wrapped around a coffee she hadn't touched. The warmth of the cafe hadn't thawed the tension in her shoulders. She was still coiled tight, like a spring ready to snap. Margaret could see it in the way her fingers twitched, the way her gaze kept flicking to the door, as if she expected to be thrown out at any moment. Margaret stirred her tea, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. She wasn't sure what to say. "I'm sorry for your loss," felt inadequate. "How can I help?" felt presumptuous. So she stayed silent, waiting for Tasha to speak first. It was Jamal who broke the quiet. "Mama used to work here," he announced, swinging his legs under the table. Tasha's head snapped up. "Jamal," she warned. But the boy continued, oblivious. "She made pancakes with faces on them. And the man with the loud laugh gave me extra syrup." Margaret studied Tasha's face. There was something familiar about her now that she looked closer. The slope of her nose, the way her eyebrows arched when she was annoyed. Margaret had seen it before. Not in person, but in photos. Michael's photos. Her breath caught. "You worked at the diner on Elm Street," Margaret said slowly. "The one with the blue awning." Tasha's eyes narrowed. "Yeah. How you know that?" Margaret's pulse thudded in her ears. She could see it now, the memory surfacing like a photograph developing in liquid. Michael had mentioned a waitress he liked, one who always remembered his order. He'd even shown Margaret a picture once, a candid shot of Tasha laughing behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour. "My son," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael. He used to go there." Tasha went very still. Then, like a dam breaking, recognition flooded her face. "Oh my God," she breathed. You're his mom?" The air between them shifted. Margaret saw the exact moment Tasha made the connection, the Billionaire Carter family. The son who died in that car accident years ago. The pieces clicked into place, and with them came a new tension, a wariness. Jamal looked between them, confused. "Who's Michael?" Tasha reached for his hand, her grip tight. "Just somebody Mama used to know," she said softly. But Margaret knew it was more than that. She could see it in the way Tasha's throat worked, the way her fingers trembled. There was a story here, one that had been buried as deep as Layla's tiny grave, and Margaret was going to uncover it. The silence between them stretched like a fraying rope, each second pulling tighter with unspoken words. Steam curled from untouched drinks as Tasha studied Margaret with new wariness, her fingers absently tracing a scratch on the table's surface. The cafe's hum of quiet conversations and clinking dishes felt suddenly distant, muffled by the weight of this unexpected connection. Margaret watched as Tasha's posture shifted, the defensive hunch of shoulders that had carried too much for too long. She recognized that stance. She'd seen it in boardrooms when junior executives feared speaking truth to power, in charity galas where recipients of her donations hesitated to make eye contact. But this was different. This wasn't about money or status. This was about her son. "Michael talked about you," Margaret ventured carefully. The admission tasted strange. She'd locked away so many memories of him, preserving them like fragile artifacts too precious to handle. Tasha's laugh came out as a sharp exhale. "Yeah? What did he say?" "That I messed up his order sometimes." There was no real humor in it, just the tired deflection of someone accustomed to being underestimated. Margaret surprised herself by smiling. "Actually, he said you were the only one who got it right every time. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, bacon crispy but not burnt." The words conjured an image of Michael leaning across the diner counter, that boyish grin he'd never outgrown. Something in Tasha's expression softened momentarily before hardening again. She glanced at Jamal, now engrossed in drawing patterns in the condensation on his mug. "Your boy was..." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Different. Not like the other rich folks who came in. He saw people." The simple observation struck Margaret with unexpected force. She'd spent years building monuments to Michael's memory, scholarships in his name, wings at hospitals bearing the Carter legacy. But this woman had known something fundamental about him that no marble plaque could capture. Jamal piped up suddenly. "Mama says seeing people is port, Aunt. Like when my teacher didn't see I needed help with letters, but Mama did." Tasha squeezed his shoulder, but her eyes never left Margaret's face. "Your son promised to help me once. Said if I ever needed anything." Her voice trailed off, fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "Guess it don't matter now." Margaret felt the unspoken accusation like a physical blow. Another of Michael's unfinished promises. Another way she'd failed him. The air between them grew thick with all that remained unsaid, about loss, about justice deferred, about how the world kept turning for some while grinding others beneath its wheels. Outside, rain began pattering against the windows, blurring the world beyond the glass. In that moment, Margaret made a decision that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her son, about herself, about the gulf between privilege and survival. "Tell me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tell me everything." And as Tasha began to speak, Margaret Carter, billionaire philanthropist, corporate titan, grieving mother, finally learned what it meant to truly listen. Tasha's fingers trembled slightly as she cradled her coffee cup, the warmth long since faded. The words came slowly at first, halting and uncertain, as if she were testing the waters of Margaret's sincerity. But as she spoke, the dam broke, and the story poured out in a flood of pain and frustration that had been building for years. Margaret listened without interruption, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms as Tasha described the impossible choices poverty demanded, choosing between rent and medicine, between food and electricity, between dignity and survival. She learned how Tasha had worked double shifts at the diner while pregnant, her feet swollen and aching, because taking a day off meant losing pay they couldn't afford to lose. She heard about the dismissive glances from doctors when Tasha voiced concerns about her baby's health, the way her worries had been brushed aside until it was too late. But most devastating of all was the moment Tasha's voice cracked as she whispered, "They said if we'd caught it sooner, but sooner meant tests we couldn't pay for." Sooner meant doctors who would actually listen. Margaret's chest tightened with a grief that wasn't hers but felt just as heavy. She thought of the hospitals that bore her family's name, the millions donated to medical research, the galas where wealthy patrons sipped champagne and patted themselves on the back for their generosity, while women like Tasha fell through the cracks of a system designed to fail them. Jamal, sensing his mother's distress, climbed onto her lap and pressed his face against her shoulder. Tasha held him close, her arms wrapping around him like armor. "After Layla," she said quietly, "I promised Jamal I'd never let anything happen to him. But how do you promise that when the world don't care if people like us live or die?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unflinching. Margaret had no answer. She had spent her life believing in meritocracy, in the idea that hard work guaranteed success. But Tasha worked harder in a single week than Margaret ever had, and it still hadn't been enough to save her daughter. A memory surfaced then Michael, years ago, arguing with her over dinner about some social justice cause she'd dismissed as unrealistic. "You don't get it, Mom," he'd said, frustration coloring his voice. "You've never had to wonder if the system was built to work against you." Now, sitting across from Tasha, Margaret finally understood what he'd meant. Without a word, she reached into her purse and pulled out a checkbook. Tasha stiffened, her expression hardening. "I don't want your pity money," she said sharply. Margaret met her gaze. "It's not pity," she said. "It's a debt. My son made you a promise. Let me keep it." She wrote the check not as charity, but as restitution. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She asked, rather than dictated, "What else do you need?" Tasha stared at the check, then at Margaret, as if seeing her for the first time. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility. And for the first time since Michael's death, Margaret felt like she was finally doing something that might have made him proud. The check was only the beginning. Margaret had expected Tasha to take the money and disappear most people in her position would have. But Tasha Williams wasn't most people. When she looked at the amount written on that slip of paper, her first reaction wasn't gratitude or relief. It was anger. "This won't bring her back," Tasha said, her voice low and trembling. The check lay untouched between them on the cafe table, a stark rectangle of privilege against the chipped wood surface. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but Tasha wasn't finished. "And what about the next woman like me? The next baby who dies because their mama can't afford the golden ticket to healthcare?" Tasha's fingers curled into fists. "Your money's a band-aid on a bullet wound, Miss Carter. It don't fix nothing long-term." The words should have stung, but instead, they ignited something in Margaret that had been dormant for years, a spark of the woman she'd been before wealth had insulated her from hard truths. She thought of Michael again, of how he'd tried to tell her these same things in his own way. Across the table, Jamal watched them both with wide, solemn eyes. He'd stopped drawing in the condensation on his cup. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of them. "Then tell me what will," Margaret said. It wasn't a challenge, it was surrender. For the first time in her adult life, she was ready to follow rather than lead. Tasha studied her face, searching for deception. What she found must have satisfied her, because what came next would change both their lives forever. They started with Layla's medical records. Then they moved on to the hospital policies. Then the insurance loopholes. Each layer they peeled back revealed another injustice, another way the system was designed to fail people like Tasha. Margaret's legal team, accustomed to protecting corporate interests, now found themselves compiling evidence of systemic neglect. News outlets picked up the story. "Billionaire takes on healthcare inequality," the headlines read. But Margaret made sure every interview centered Tasha's experience. She used her name, her connections, her influence not to speak for Tasha, but to amplify her voice. Protests formed outside the hospital where Layla had been turned away. Mothers held pictures of their own children lost to a system that valued profits over people. Margaret stood beside Tasha at the podium, but it was Tasha's words that rang out across the crowd. "We ain't asking for charity. We're demanding what's ours by right, the right to live, the right to be seen, the right to matter." The movement grew. What began as one woman's grief became a chorus of voices too loud to ignore. Politicians who had once courted Margaret's donations now found themselves facing uncomfortable questions. Board members at prestigious hospitals resigned. Policies changed. And through it all, Margaret kept seeing Michael in the determined set of Tasha's shoulders when she spoke to reporters, in Jamal's laughter as he played in her office while they worked late, in the quiet moments when Tasha would pause to trace Layla's name on the memorial bracelet she never took off. She'd spent years building monuments to her son's memory. But this fight, this purpose was the legacy he would have wanted. Not a statue or a namesake building, but a world made better. As the first snow of winter began to fall outside her penthouse window one evening, Margaret realized something that would have shocked her younger self. She was no longer the lonely billionaire visiting a grave. She was part of something bigger, and it was just the beginning. The cemetery looked different in spring. Margaret stood between the two graves, now Michael's polished marble headstone on one side, Layla's smaller marker on the other. The air smelled of fresh earth and blooming flowers, a stark contrast to the cold bitterness of that first meeting months ago. Tasha stood beside her, Jamal's small hand clasped in hers. The boy had grown taller since Margaret had known him, his laughter louder, his eyes brighter. He placed a single yellow dandelion on Layla's grave, his sister, he'd never met but talked about often. "For Layla," he said solemnly, then immediately ruined the moment by giggling when a butterfly landed on his shoe. Margaret smiled. She'd forgotten how much noise children brought with them, how much life. Her penthouse, once a sterile monument to solitude, now had crayon drawings on the refrigerator and a small pile of toy cars perpetually scattered across the rug. Tasha nudged her shoulder. "You thinking about him?" Margaret didn't need to ask who she meant. "Every day," she admitted. "But it's different now. Less like drowning. More like," she struggled for the right word, "like he's still doing good in the world?" Tasha offered. Margaret nodded, surprised at how accurately Tasha had named the feeling. The foundation they'd started in Michael and Layla's names had already helped hundreds of families, black mothers who'd been turned away from hospitals, children who needed medical care their parents couldn't afford, people who'd been invisible until someone powerful enough finally listened. It wasn't perfect. The system didn't change overnight, but it was a start. Jamal tugged at Margaret's sleeve. "Grandma Margie, can we get ice cream now? You promised." The title still startled her sometimes. She'd never expected to be anyone's grandmother, least of all to this vibrant, noisy boy who'd somehow carved a place for himself in her carefully ordered world. Tasha laughed. "Yeah, Grandma Margie, you promised." There was teasing in her voice, but something softer underneath, an acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them, forged in shared grief and purpose. Margaret pretended to consider it. "Well, if I promised." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her keys, dangling them just out of Jamal's reach. "But only if you can beat me to the car." Jamal shrieked with delight and took off running, his sneakers kicking up fresh grass. Tasha followed at a more sedate pace, shaking her head at their antics but smiling. Margaret paused just for a moment, turning back to the two graves. "We're doing okay," she whispered. Then louder, "Wait for me, you little speed demon." And as she chased after Jamal, her laughter blending with his in the spring air, Margaret realized this was the thing no amount of money could ever buy, this messy, imperfect, beautiful second chance at family. The story doesn't end here, of course. Stories like this never really do. There are more battles to fight, more changes to make, more lives to touch. But for now, in this moment, with the sun warm on her face and Jamal's giggles ringing in her ears, it was enough. Subscribe for more heartfelt stories. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more tales of hope, resilience, and the power of human connection. Stories like Margaret and Tasha's remind us that change is possible when we choose to see each other, really see each other across the divides of privilege and circumstance. Your subscription helps support the creation of meaningful content that challenges, inspires, and entertains. Together, we can keep sharing stories that matter, stories that don't just get told, but lived. Because everyone has a story worth hearing, especially those who've been told their voices don't matter. Click subscribe now, and let's keep changing the narrative one story at a time.